Hi guys, so chapters 12 and 13 are going to be together on your activity sheets. And so this video is going to be a little bit longer because I'm going to read both chapters in one sitting. So you're going to see that there's 2 pages and they both are talking about cause and effect. So there's a cause, something happens, and what's the effect of that? You have to answer what you think, because something happened, what did it cause something else to happen? What was the effect? And then there's also just a couple short questions at the bottom of the second page. So again, I'm going to read 12 and 13 today. All right? Okay, here we go. Chapter 12 is called A Rescue. Lewis liked to sleep on the lake. At night, after blowing taps, he would waddle down to the sandy beach by the dock. There, he removed his slate, his chalk pencil, and his trumpet and hid them under a bush. Then he shoved off into the water. As soon as he was afloat, he would tuck his head under a wing, and for a while he would doze and think about home and his parents. Then he would think about Serena, how beautiful she was and how much he loved her. Pretty soon he would be fast asleep. When daylight came, he would swim ashore and eat a light breakfast of water plants. Let's see here. Sorry, I just lost my place. Then he'd put on his things, climb onto a flat rock, and blow reveille. The boys, hearing the trumpet, would wake and rush to the dock to swim before breakfast. And guys and girls reveille is that dun 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 dun. That's what that is. After supper at night, the campers would often play volleyball. Lewis loved the game. He couldn't hop around as fast as the boys, but he could reach far out with his long neck and poke the ball into the air and over the net. It was very hard to get a ball past Lewis. He could return almost any shot. When the boys chose sides at the start of the game, Lewis was always the first to be chosen. The boys loved camp life in Ontario. They learned how to handle a canoe. They learned to swim. Sam Beaver took them on nature walks and taught them to sit quietly on a log and observe wild creatures and birds. He showed them how to walk in the woods without making a lot of noise. Sam showed them where the kingfisher had its nest in a hole in the bank by a stream. He showed them the partridge and her chicks, and when the boys heard a soft "Go, go, go, go," Sam told them that they were listening to the saw-it owl. Smallest of the owls, no bigger than a man's hand. Sometimes in the middle of the night, the whole camp would wake to the scream of a wildcat. Nobody ever saw a wildcat during the entire summer, but his scream was heard at night. One morning when Sam was playing tennis with Applegate Skinner, Sam heard a clanking noise. He looked behind him, and there, coming out of the woods, was a skunk. Whoa. The skunk's head was stuck in a tin can, and he couldn't see where he was going. He kept bumping into trees and rocks, and the can went clank, clank, clank. "That skunk's in trouble," said Sam, laying down his racket. "He's been to the dump looking for food. He poked his head into that empty can, and now he can't get it out." The word spread quickly through camp that a skunk had arrived. The boys came running to see the fun. Mr. Brickle warned them not to get too close. The skunk might squirt them with perfume. So the boys danced around, keeping their distance and holding their noses. The big question was how to get the can off the skunk's head without getting squirted. "He's going to need help," said Sam. "That skunk will starve to death if we don't get that can off." All the boys had suggestions. One boy said they should make a bow and arrow, tie a string to the arrow, and shoot the arrow at the can. Then, when they hit the can, they could pull the string and the can would come off the skunk's head. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. It sounded like too much work. Another boy suggested that 2 boys climb a tree, and one boy could hang by his feet from the other boy's hands. And when the skunk walked under the tree, the boy who was hanging by his feet could reach down and pull the can off. And if the skunk squirted, the perfume wouldn't hit the boy because he would be hanging in the air. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. Mr. Brickle didn't like it at all. He said it was extremely impractical, and furthermore, he wouldn't permit it. Another boy suggested that they get a block of wood, smear it with glue, and when the skunk knocked against it, the can would stick to the block of wood. Nobody thought much of that suggestion. Mr. Brickle said he didn't have any glue anyway. While everybody was making suggestions, Sam Beaver walked quietly to his tent. He returned in a few minutes with a long pole, and a piece of fish line. Sam tied one end of the fish line to the pole, and then he tied a slip knot on the other end of the line and formed a noose. He climbed to the roof of the porch and asked the other boys not to get too close to the skunk. The skunk, all this time, was blundering around, blindly bumping into things. It was a pitiful sight. Sam, holding the pole, waited patiently on the roof. when he looked like a fisherman waiting for a bite. When the skunk wandered close to the building, Sam reached over, dangled the noose in front of the skunk, slipped the noose around the can, and gave a jerk. The noose tightened and the can came off. As it did so, the skunk turned around and squirted right at Mr. Brickle, who jumped back, stumbled, and fell. All the boys danced around holding their noses, and the skunk ran off into the woods. Mr. Brickle got up and dusted himself off. The air smelled strong of skunk. Mr. Brickle smelled too. "Congratulations, Sam," said Mr. Brickle. "You have aided a wild creature and have given Camp Kookooskoos a delicious dash of wild perfume. I'm sure we'll all remember this maladrous event for a long time to come. I don't see how we can very well forget it." "Go!" cried Lewis, lifting his trumpet. The lake echoed with the sound. The air was heavy with a rich, musky smell of skunk. The boys danced and danced, holding their noses, and some of them held their stomachs and pretended to throw up. Then Mr. Brickle announced it was time for the morning swim. "A swim will clear the air," he said as he walked away toward the cottage to change his clothes. After lunch each day, the campers went to their tents for a rest period. Some of them read books, some wrote letters home telling their parents how bad the food was. Some just lay on their cots and talked. One afternoon during rest period, the boys in Applegate's tent began teasing him about his name. "Applegate Skinner," said one boy. Where did you get such a crazy name, Applegate?" "My parents gave it to me," replied Applegate. "I know what his name is," said another boy. Sour Applegate Skinner." The boys howled at this and began chanting, "Sour Applegate Skinner, Sour Applegate, Sour Applegate, Sour Applegate." "Quiet!" bellowed the tent leader. "I don't think it's funny," said Applegate. "His name is not Sour Applegate," said another boy. "His name is Wormy Applegate. Wormy Applegate Skinner." This suggestion was greeted with screams of laughter. "Quiet!" bellowed the tent leader. "I want quiet in this tent, and leave Applegate alone." "Leave rotten Applegate alone?" said another boy, and some of the other boys had to pull their pillows over their heads so their snickering could not be heard. Applegate was sore. When the rest period was over, he wandered down to the dock, and he didn't like being made fun of. He wanted to do something to get even. Without even saying anything to anybody, he slid a canoe out into the water and paddled out onto the lake, heading for the opposite shore a mile away. No one noticed him. Applegate had no business taking a canoe out alone. He had not passed his swimming test. He had not passed his canoe test. He was disobeying a camp rule. When he was a quarter of a mile from there, in deep water, the wind grew stronger. The waves got higher. The canoe was hard to manage, and Applegate got scared. Suddenly, a wave caught the canoe and spun it around. Applegate leaned hard on his paddle, and his hand slipped, and he lost his balance. The canoe tipped over. Applegate found himself in the water. His clothes felt terribly soggy and heavy. His shoes drug him down, and he could barely keep his head above water. Instead of hanging onto the canoe, he started swimming toward shore, which was a crazy thing to do. One wave hit him square in the face, and he got a mouthful of water. "Help!" he screamed. "Help me, I'm drowning. It'll give the camp a bad name if I drown. Help! Help!" Counselors sprinted to the waterfront, and they jumped into canoes and rowboats and started for the drowning boy. One counselor kicked his moccasins off, dove in, and began swimming toward Applegate. Mr. Brickle raced to the dock, climbing to the diving tower, and directed the rescue operation, shouting through a megaphone. "Hang on to the canoe, Applegate," he shouted. "Don't leave the canoe." But Applegate had already left the canoe. He was all alone, thrashing about and wasting his strength. He felt sure he would soon go to the bottom and drown. He felt weak and scared. Water had gotten into his lungs. He couldn't last much longer. The first boat to get away from the dock was rowed by Sam Beaver, and Sam was pulling hard at the oars, straining every muscle. But things did not look good for Applegate. The boats were still a long way from the boy. When the first cry for help was heard in camp, Lewis was coming around the corner of the main lodge. He spied Applegate immediately and responded to the call. "I can't fly out there," thought Lewis, "because my flight feathers have been falling out lately, but I can certainly make better time than those boats." Dropping his slate and his chalk pencil and his trumpet, Lewis splashed into the water and struck out, beating his wings and kicking with his great webbed feet. A swan, even in the summer when he can't fly, can scoot across the water at high speed. Lewis's powerful wings beat the air. His feet churned the waves as though they were running on top of the water. In a moment he had passed all the boats. When he reached Applegate, he quickly dove, pointed his long neck between Applegate's legs, and then came to the surface with Applegate sitting on his back. Cheers came from the people on the shore and in the boats. Applegate clung to Lewis's neck. He had been saved in the nick of time. Another minute, and he would have gone to the bottom. Water would have filled his lungs. He would have been a goner. "Thank God," said Mr. Brickle through his megaphone. "Great work, Lewis. Camp Kookooskoos will never forget this day. The reputation of the camp has been saved. Our record for safety is still untarnished." Lewis didn't pay much attention to all the shouting. He swam very carefully over to Sam's boat, and Sam pulled Applegate into the boat and helped him into the stern seat. "You looked pretty funny riding a swan," Sam said, "and you're lucky to be alive. You're not supposed to go out alone in a canoe." But Applegate was too scared and wet to say anything. He just sat and stared straight ahead, spitting water out of his mouth and breathing hard. At supper that night, Mr. Brickle placed Lewis at his right in the place of honor. When the meal was over, he rose and made a speech. "We all saw what happened on the lake today. Applegate Skinner broke a camp rule, took a canoe out alone and upset. He was drowning when Lewis the Swan, rapidly outdistancing all other campers, reached his side, held him up, and saved his life. Let us all give Lewis a standing ovation." The boys and the counselors stood up. They cheered and clapped and beat on tin plates with spoons. Then they sat down, and Lewis looked embarrassed. "And now, Applegate," said Mr. Brickle, "I hope the rescue has caused you to change your opinion of birds. The first day you were here in camp, you told us you didn't care for birds. How do you feel now?" "I feel sick to my stomach," replied Applegate. "It makes you sick at your stomach to almost drown. My stomach still has lots of lake water in it." "Yes, but what about birds?" asked Mr. Brickle. Applegate thought hard. "Well, I'm grateful to Lewis for saving my life, but I still don't like birds." "Really?" said Mr. Brickle. "That's quite remarkable. Even though a bird saved you from drowning, you don't care for birds. What have you got against birds?" "Nothing," replied Applegate. "I have nothing against them. I just don't care for them." "Okay," said Mr. Brickle. "I guess we'll just have to leave it at that. But the camp is proud of Lewis. He is our most distinguished counselor, a great trumpet player, a great bird, a powerful swimmer, and a fine friend. He deserves a medal. In fact, I intend to write a letter recommending that he be given the life-saving medal." Mr. Brickle did as he promised. He wrote a letter, and a few days later a man arrived from Washington with the life-saving medal, and while all the campers watched, he hung the medal around Lewis's neck, alongside the trumpet, the slate, the chalk pencil. It was a beautiful medal. Engraved on it were the words, "To Lewis the Swan, who with outstanding courage and complete disregard for his own safety saved the life of Applegate Skinner." Lewis took off his slate and wrote, "Thank you for this medal. It is a great honor." But he thought to himself, "I'm beginning to get overloaded with stuff around my neck. I've got a trumpet, I've got a slate, I've got a chalk pencil, now I've got a medal. I'm beginning to look like a hippie. I hope I'll still be able to fly when my flight feathers grow in again." That night, when darkness came, Lewis blew the most beautiful taps he had ever blown. The man who had brought the medal was listening and watching. He could hardly believe his ears and his eyes. When he returned to the city, he told people what he had seen and heard. Lewis's fame was growing. His name was known. People all over were beginning to talk about the swan that could play a trumpet. Well, that was an exciting chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. All right, chapter 13, because I told you, remember, we have two going into on one activity. So this is called End of Summer. A trumpet has 3 valves. They are for the fingers of the player. They look like this. So here's a picture, and you'll see the 3 valves right there. Okay? By pushing them down in the right order, the player can produce all the notes of the musical scale. Lewis had often examined these 3 little valves on his horn, but he had never been able to use them. He had 3 front toes on each foot, but being a water bird, he had webbed feet. The webbing prevented him from using his 3 toes independently. Luckily, the valves on a trumpet are not needed for bugle calls, because bugle calls are just combinations of do, mi, so, and a trumpeter can play do, mi, so without pressing down any of the valves. "If I could just work those 3 valves with my 3 toes," he said to himself, "I could play all sorts of music, not just bugle calls. I could play jazz, I could play country western, I could play rock, I could play the great music of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Sibelius, Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Brahms, everybody. I could really be a trumpet player, not just a camp bugler. I might even get a job with the orchestra. The thought filled him with ambition. Louis loved music, and besides, he was already casting about for ways of making money after camp was over. Although he enjoyed life at Camp Kookooskoos, Louis often thought of his home on Upper Red Rock Lake in Montana. He thought about his parents, his brothers and sisters, and about Serena. He was terribly in love with Serena, and he often wondered what was happening to her. At night, he would look up at the stars and think about her. In the late evening, when the big bullfrogs were calling across the still lake, he would think of Serena. Sometimes he felt sad, lonely, and homesick. His music, however, was a comfort to him. He loved the sound of his own trumpet. Summer passed all too quickly, and on the last day of camp, Mr. Brickle called his counselors together and paid them what he owed them. Louis received $100, the first money he had ever earned. He had no wallet and no pockets, so Mr. Brickle placed the money in a waterproof bag that had a drawstring. He hung this money bag around Louis's neck, along with the trumpet, the slate, the chalk pencil, and the life-saving medal. Louis went to Sam Beaver's tent and found Sam packing his things. Louis took off his slate and pencil. "I need another job," he wrote. "Where should I go?" Sam sat down on his bed and thought for a while. Then he said, "Go to Boston. Maybe you can get a job with the Swan boat." Louis had never been to Boston, and he had no idea what the Swan boat was, but he nodded his head, and then on his slate he wrote, "Do me a favor?" "Sure," said Sam. "Take a razor blade and slit the web on my right foot so I can wiggle my toes." He held out his foot. "Why do you want to wiggle your toes?" asked Sam. "You'll see," wrote Louis. "I need my toes in my business." Sam hesitated. Then he borrowed a razor blade from one of his older counselors. He made a long, neat cut between Louis's inner toe and middle toe. Then he made another cut between Louis's middle toe and outer toe. "Does it hurt?" Louis shook his head. He lifted his trumpet, placed his toes on the valves, and played do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Do, ti, la, so, fa, mi, re, do. Go-ho! Sam grinned. "The Swan boat will hire you, all right," he said. "You're a real trumpeter now. But with your web cut, swimming will be hard for you. You will have a tendency to swim in circles because your left foot will push harder than your right foot." "It's okay, I can manage," wrote Louis. "Thanks very much for the surgery." Next day, the campers left. The canoe had been hoisted onto racks in the boathouse. The float had been hauled in onto the beach. The windows of the lodge had been boarded up against bears and squirrels. Mattresses had been packed into zipper bags. Everything was snug and ready for the long, silent winter. Of all the campers, only Louis stayed behind. His flight feathers were growing fast, but he still couldn't fly. He made up his mind he would remain at camp all alone until he was able to take to the air again, and then he would fly straight to Boston. The lake was lonely without the boys, but Louis didn't mind being alone. For the next 3 weeks, he took life easy. He grew his flight feathers, dreamed of Serena by day and by night, and practiced his trumpet. He'd listened to music all summer. Several of the boys had radios and record players, and now he practiced the songs of his trumpet. Every day he got better and better, and one day he composed a love song for Serena and wrote the words and music on a slate. And the words are, "Oh, ever in the greening spring, by bank and bough retiring, for love shall be sorrowing, and swans of my desiring." He was really thinking of Serena, but he left her name out of it and kept it impersonal. His plumage was beautiful now, and he felt great. On the 21st of September, he tried his wings. To his great relief, they lifted him. Louis rose into the air. The trumpet banged against the slate knocked against the money bag, the life-saving medal clinked against the chalk pencil, but Louis was airborne again. He climbed and climbed and headed for Boston. It was wonderful to be in the sky again. "Flying is a lot harder than it was before I acquired all these possessions," thought Louis. "The best way to travel really is to travel light. On the other hand, I have to have these things. I've got to have a trumpet if I'm to win Serena for my wife. I've got to carry this money bag to hold the money to pay my father's debt. I've got to have this slate and pencil so I can communicate with people, and I ought to wear the medal because I really did save a life. And if I didn't wear it, people might think I was ungrateful." On and on he flew toward Boston, which is the capital of Massachusetts, and which is famous for its baked beans, its codfish, its tea parties, its Cabots, its Lowells, its Salonstalls, and its Swan boats. Thanks for listening. See you next time.